Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Abraham Lincoln, Part 8, Secession of the Confederate States of America from the USA. We stopped last time in 1860. Abraham Lincoln had been elected U.S. President, 16th U.S. President, the first Republican president in November, and the country was headed toward the Civil War conflict between North and South over the slavery issue. There was the long transition between the election in November and inauguration in March, so that's how many months? Almost 5 months. And Lincoln was dealing with division, all kinds of conflict, and division within the Republican Party. Aside from issues with Democrats, all factions in the Republican Party were pushing him in different directions. Of course, that continued throughout the Civil War, and he did very well dealing with that. Now, one of the tough issues was the border states. Well, eventually, when the slave states that did not join the Confederacy, namely Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland. And probably the most important, well, maybe the second most important state was Kentucky. And that itself, Kentucky was complicated because there were three regions. There were secessionists in the South who wanted to leave the Union on the border of Tennessee, and Unionists loyal to the Union in the North by the Ohio River. In the central part of the state, the people who just wanted to get along. On November 20th, Abraham Lincoln said, quote, "Each and all of the states will be left in as complete control of their own affairs respectively, and at as perfect liberty to choose and employ their own means of protecting property and preserving peace and order within their respective limits, as they have ever been under any administration." In other words, he was not going to interfere with slavery in the slave states. He just didn't want it to be extended. In December, Abraham Lincoln said, quote, "Let there be no compromise on the question of extending slavery. Stand firm. The tug has to come, and better now than any time hereafter." The New Orleans Crescent newspaper said, quote, "The Northern people in electing Mr. Lincoln have perpetrated a deliberate, cold-blooded insult and outrage on the people of the slave-holding states." So that was one reaction from the South. But you could see Lincoln was not going to compromise on the issue of extending slavery. He would fight that. The St. Louis, Missouri Democrat-Republican newspaper reported, quote, "Throughout the campaign, Abraham Lincoln has been portrayed by most newspapers as an abolitionist, a fanatic of the John Brown type. Never was a public man so outrageously misrepresented. The Richmond, Virginia Inquirer wrote, quote, "The Northern people, by a sectional vote, have elected a president for the avowed purpose of aggression on Southern rights. This is a declaration of war." So again, you can see this a Southern reaction to the election of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln believed that the plantation owners were angry at his election, but the yeoman farmers were not and did not support separation or secession. He believed that sensible leaders in the South would stop any final move towards separation. However, on December 20th, the fateful news came in South Carolina. Excuse me. A convention was held, voting. And they voted to unanimously to secede from the Union. The vote was held in Charleston, South Carolina, the capital. So this was the first state that voted to secede from the Union. In other words, leave. Abraham Lincoln was quiet did not have a public comment. The Illinois State Journal wrote, quote, "The President of the United States has a duty to perform. Disunion by armed force is treason, and treason must and will be put down at all hazards." During the next 40 days, the southern states which voted to leave the Union included Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. And they all voted to leave the Union or secede. So the country was disintegrating, and Abraham Lincoln was preparing for his inauguration on March 4th. During his preparation for his presidency, he studied Andrew Jackson's proclamation regarding the nullification crisis of 1832, when there was this conflict with South Carolina, where they over the tariff, and South Carolina was talking at that time about seceding. And during these dramatic days, fateful days in December and moving into the new year, 1861, in the southern states mentioned which seceded. They seized federal arsenals and forts within their borders. Only Fort Pickens in Pensacola, Florida, and Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, remained under Union control. During this time, Abraham Lincoln said, quote, "The right of a state to secede is not an open or debatable question. It is the duty of a president to execute the laws and maintain the existing government. He cannot entertain any proposition for dissolution or dismemberment. No state can in any way lawfully get out of the Union without the consent of the others." In other words, he was not going to accept these states leaving the Union. Say, oh, okay, fine. He would not accept that. His wife, Mary, during this time said, quote, "My husband was a terribly firm man when he set his foot down. No man or woman could rule him after he had made up his mind." See, Lincoln was a very agreeable, very personable, he was an easygoing man, but some people thought he was weak, and he was not. He was a very strong man, and that strength was needed, along with his other good qualities in the Civil War. Lincoln was studying and moving into January of 1861 the speeches of Daniel Webster regarding the nullification crisis of 1830, when South Carolina was threatening to secede over the issue of tariff. Daniel Webster had said, quote, "Liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable." On January 30th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln traveled by train and horse and buggy to Farmington, Illinois, to see his aging stepmother, Sarah Bush Lincoln, and he visited his father's grave, which had been unmarked since his father died 10 years earlier. And at that time, Lincoln ordered a stone marker for his father's gravesite. Now, their Springfield home, Abraham and Mary's Springfield home, they decided to rent out while they were in Washington, and they rented it to a man named Lucian Titan for $350 a year. So they got their things and brought what they needed to Washington and put the rest in storage. February 10th, 1861 was Abraham Lincoln's last day in Springfield, Illinois. He visited with his law partner, Billy Herndon, and he mentioned their sign over the law office was Lincoln and Herndon, and Lincoln said, quote, "Let it hang there undisturbed. If I live, I'm coming back sometime, and then we'll go on practicing law as if nothing ever happened." So, Abraham Lincoln arrived at the train station in Springfield. Newspaperman Villard reported, quote, "The president-elect took his station in the waiting room and allowed his friends to pass by him and take his hand for the last time." So Abraham Lincoln spoke to the crowd at the train station and said, quote, "My friends, no one not in my position can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting. To this place and the kindness of these people I owe everything. I leave not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon George Washington." So this was a touching departure. Yeah, he had come to Springfield, Illinois as a young man, and really didn't have a very simple, humble background, and he had made all these friends and had become successful, and now he was going to Washington to become president, although he was facing this, the greatest crisis, even a tougher crisis than the American Revolution, the War of Independence that George Washington led. Abraham Lincoln, as a young boy, had a great reverence for George Washington, based on the biography written by Mason Locke Weems' Life of George Washington. And now he continued in this speech to the people at the train station in Springfield, quote, Without the assistance of the divine being, whoever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail. Trusting in him who can go with me and remain with you and be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his care commending you, as I hope in your prayers you will commend me. So that was very touching. He's talking about how he needed God's help to face this tough situation. Abraham Lincoln's friend James Conkling described that scene, quote, "Many eyes were filled to overflowing. Mr. Lincoln's breast heaved with emotion, and he could scarcely command his feelings sufficiently to commence." So off he went, Abraham and Mary and their 2 boys. The train passed through Indianapolis in Illinois, Indiana, Columbus, Ohio, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and other points east. Jefferson Davis was the new president-elect of the Confederate States of America. On that same day, he traveled from his plantation in Briarfield, Mississippi, and traveled to Vicksburg, Mississippi, on to Jackson, Chattanooga, Atlanta, and then Montgomery, Alabama, the new capital of the Confederacy, for his inauguration as the President of the Confederate States of America. So, again, on the trip to Washington from Springfield, they passed Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Columbus, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Cleveland, Ohio, Buffalo, New York, Albany, and New York City. There were flagmen stationed at every road crossing and at half-mile intervals along the tracks. A lot of people came they knew the route, and they came to wave and to see Abraham Lincoln on his way to Washington. And this trip gave Americans a chance to see their new president. This is in the age before television or any mass communication. Abraham Lincoln was the first president born west of the Appalachian Mountains. In Indianapolis, Indiana, Rutherford B. Hayes, who was a future president, had this to say about Abraham Lincoln's attempt to bow to the crowds, quote, "His chin rises, his body breaks in 2 at the hips. There is bend of the knees at a queer angle. As homely as he is, if you can get a good view of him by daylight when he is talking, he is by no means ill-looking." February 15th, Abraham Lincoln's train made a stop in Cleveland, Ohio. There were cheering spectators who stood in deep mud on Euclid Avenue, and Abraham Lincoln said to the people in Cleveland, quote, "Frequent allusion is made to the excitement at present existing in our national politics, and it is as well that I should also allude to it here. I think that there is no occasion for any excitement. The crisis, as it is called, is an altogether an artificial crisis." Now, during these stops at towns and train stations, Abraham and his wife Mary would appear at the back of the train on the platform, and one of the comments Abraham Lincoln would say to the crowd that they could see, quote, "the long and the short of it." Of course, he was tall and his wife was fairly short. Now, Lincoln made a stop in Lafayette, Indiana, and said, quote, "While some of us may differ in political opinions, still we are all united in one feeling for the Union. We all believe in the maintenance of the Union, of every star and of every stripe of the glorious flag." He had this to say about his election, quote, "A mere accident and not through any merit of mine." You can see his humility. Excuse me. Abraham Lincoln his train arrived in New York City February 19th. A crowd of 200,000 people came to see him, including the poet Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman wrote, quote, "Abraham Lincoln looked with curiosity upon that immense sea of faces, and the sea of faces returned to look with similar curiosity." February 21st, Lincoln's train arrived in Trenton, New Jersey, and Lincoln gave a speech to the New Jersey legislature, and he talked about, of all the accounts for, quote, "the struggles for liberties, none remains so fixed in his mind as George Washington crossing the Delaware River, or recrossing it actually, to defeat the British at Trenton, New Jersey, on December 26, 1776. So he was in Trenton, making a reference to that very important battle in the American Revolution, which was a turning point in the war, which looked to be lost at that point in 1776. Lincoln said, quote, "I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. I have often inquired of myself what great principle or idea it was that kept this Confederacy so long together. Something in the Declaration gave liberty not alone to the people of this country, but hope to the world for all future time." See, that's a great thing he said there, because throughout history, most countries have been ruled by tyrants, and the people have not been free. And America was a land of freedom and opportunity, and which meant that other countries could do the same thing. Abraham Lincoln arrived in Philadelphia on February 2nd, 4 p.m., and he declared his fidelity to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And he had this to say about Independence Hall, of course, where the Declaration of Independence was signed and where the Constitution was signed and created. He said, quote, "All my political warfare has been in favor of the teachings coming forth from that sacred hall. May my right hand forget its cunning, and my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if ever I prove false to those teachings." Now in Philadelphia at that time there was a new American flag with 34 stars, the final star for Kansas, which had been admitted as a state on January 29th. Lincoln spoke to a huge crowd in Philadelphia and said, quote, "I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence." Now in Philadelphia, Lincoln learned that there was a plot to kill him before he arrived in Washington City, and that plan was to kill him in Baltimore on his way to Washington. So a decision was made to change their plans, and it was decided for safety that it would be good for him to arrive secretly in Washington City, unrecognized and unannounced 10 hours ahead of schedule. Now, Lincoln initially didn't like the idea, but he agreed, and he thought, okay, well, if it really is dangerous, so you see, this is very tough. This poor guy is just coming to become president, and his life is threatened on the way there. Lincoln said, quote, "Unless there are some other reasons besides fear of ridicule, I am disposed to carry out this plan." Of course, later he regretted that decision to arrive in that fashion. Stephen B. Oates wrote, quote, "Abraham Lincoln hated to admit that the country was so torn with violent passions that a fairly elected president was threatened with assassination by his own people." George Templeton Strong, a journalist of that time, talked about the arrival. Lincoln made this arrival secretly and unannounced, and this journalist wrote, quote, "This surreptitious, nocturnal dodging or sneaking of the president-elect into this capital city under cloud of night will be used to damage his moral position and throw ridicule on his administration." Now, Frederick Douglass, the great speaker, leader of African Americans, said, quote, "Abraham Lincoln reached the capital as the poor, hunted, fugitive slave reaches the North, in disguise, seeking concealment, evading pursuers by the Underground Railroad. Between 2 days, not during the sunlight, but crawling and dodging under the sable wing of night. He changed his program, took another route, started at another hour, traveled in other company, and arrived at another time in Washington." So that was interesting comparison to the fate of fugitive slaves who were trying to come north for freedom. His first morning in Washington, Abraham Lincoln met with President James Buchanan and his cabinet in the White House. Buchanan's cabinet, and he also met Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas was not well. Lord Lyons, the British ambassador, had this to say about Abraham Lincoln, quote, "His conversation consists of vulgar anecdotes, at which he himself laughs uproariously. Now, as Inauguration Day was drawing near, the arrangements were made for sharpshooters on the roofs of buildings on Pennsylvania Avenue, the traditional route that the president-elect would take from the White House with the outgoing president to the Capitol as a security precaution. The Republican Party believed that slavery was wrong, and this was enough to produce a Southern condemnation of the Republican Party and the Union. On February 18th, in Montgomery, Alabama, Jefferson Davis was inaugurated as the President of the Confederate States of America. Now, at the reception, interesting, two of Mary's sisters attended, her sister Elodie and Martha, because apparently they were Confederate sympathizers or supporters. David S. Reynolds wrote, quote, "In Jefferson Davis's view, Southerners were refined gentlemen, while Northerners were lowly money-seekers and meddling moralists." This was the ongoing Cavalier myth. The Northern fellows, again, and the noble Cavaliers of the South. Now, before the inauguration, there was a peace conference that met in Washington attempting to prevent war, and John Tyler, the former president, met with President-elect Abraham Lincoln, along with these other members of the conference, at the Willard Hotel, and these men implored Lincoln to yield to the just demands of the South so that there would not be, quote, national bankruptcy in which, quote, grass shall grow in the streets of our commercial cities. Abraham Lincoln's response was that the Constitution must be obeyed. Let grass grow where it may. In other words, he was not going to agree to the expansion of slavery into the Northwest Territory. So, the Confederate States had seceded from the Union, and then now he brought up the question of that South Carolina could secede from the Confederate States. That once you start the secession business, what's to prevent a total breakdown? And Lincoln said, quote, "Plainly, the central idea of secession is the essence of anarchy." These Southern Confederacy, they could break up, and so then you have like how many countries? Stephen B. Oates wrote, quote, "If Southerners did not like him, they could vote him out in 1864, but they had no right whatever to separate from the Union, and he was not going to let them go, for that would set a catastrophic precedent, that any unhappy state could leave the Union at any time. The principle of secession was disintegration, and no government had ever been established which allowed for its own destruction." That's some people say, oh, well, the Constitution was voluntary, and so they should be allowed to go out. But this makes the strong argument that no, that the country would break up, and there would be chaos, and how many different countries, and who knows, they'd be at war with each other. It would be the end of the country. May 4th was Inauguration Day, and two of Mary's sisters were at Abraham's inauguration, Elizabeth and Margaret. So March 4th was the big day. Abraham Lincoln and James Buchanan rode a carriage along Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House to the Capitol. And James Buchanan said, quote, "If you are as happy in entering the White House as I shall feel on returning to Wheatland, you are a happy man." Now, that was a famous quote that apparently more than one outgoing president had said to the incoming one, that they were, that they'd had enough of being president. Now, the U.S. Capitol had no dome in 1861. The old wooden dome had been removed, and a new iron dome had not yet been installed. These were turbulent times. At the inauguration, Abraham Lincoln said, quote, "Apprehension seems to exist among the people of the Southern states that by the accession of a Republican administration, their property and their peace and personal security are endangered. There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. Indeed, the most ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and been open to their inspection. It is found in nearly all the public speeches of him who now addresses you. So this was part of his inaugural address. He said that he would uphold the fugitive slave law. Lincoln's message was that the South had nothing to fear from him. He continued, quote, I hold that in contemplation of universal law and of the Constitution, the union of these states is perpetual. Perpetuity is implied, if not expressed, in the fundamental law of all national governments. It is safe to assert that no government proper ever had a provision in its organic law for its own termination. Plainly, the central idea of secession is the essence of anarchy. No state upon its own mere motion can lawfully get out of the Union. In view of the Constitution and the laws, the Union is unbroken. Lincoln said that it was his duty, quote, that the laws of the Union be faithfully executed in the states. I trust this will not be regarded as a menace, but only as the declared purpose of the Union, that it will be constitutionally defended and that it will constitutionally defend and maintain itself. President Lincoln continued, quote, speaking to Southerners, in your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourself the aggressor. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be by the better angels of our nature. See, that's a beautiful speech there, because he's appealing to them, please, don't break up the country. He didn't want the country to break up, and he didn't want war. Now he continued in this administration talking about the North and the South, quote, physically speaking, we cannot separate. Suppose you go to war. You cannot fight always, and when after much loss on both sides and no gain on either you cease fighting, the identical old questions are again upon you. President Lincoln concluded his inaugural address, and the Chief Justice Roger Taney stepped forward to swear him in as the new president. Chief Justice Taney had sworn in Martin Van Buren, William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, James K. Polk, Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan. The Chicago Tribune wrote about Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address, quote, no document can be found among American state papers embodying sounder wisdom and higher patriotism. The Illinois State Journal recorded, quote, the inaugural address of our noble chief magistrate has electrified the whole country. The New York Herald newspaper was critical of Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address and said, quote, that his address, quote, would have caused a George Washington to mourn and would have inspired a Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, or Andrew Jackson with contempt. So you can see he was not only dealing with the problems with the South, but problems with critics in the North. Frederick Douglass said, quote, some thought we had in Mr. Lincoln the nerve and decision of an Oliver Cromwell, but the result shows that we merely have a continuation of the Franklin Pierces and James Buchanans, and that the Republican president bends the knee to slavery as readily as any of his infamous predecessors. So Frederick Douglass was wanting, an anti-slavery an address that he didn't get. So he really came to admire Abraham Lincoln, but not at this point. The inaugural ball was held at the rear of City Hall in a room referred to as the Muslim Palace of Aladdin, quote, because of the abundance of white draperies trimmed with blue used in its decoration. So now Lincoln's wife Mary came and she danced the quadrille with Stephen Douglas, her old beau. Mary stayed for several hours at the ball, but President Lincoln departed. So this is it. Now the two boys, Willie and Tad, they as this beginning of this life in the White House, they had friends, new friends in Washington. Bud, Holly, and Julia Taft. Holly was a boy that his actual real name was Halsey, and Julia years later said, quote, "If there was any motto or slogan of the White House during the early years, it was this: let the children have a good time." Now there's a good story. President Lincoln told a story in Decatur, Illinois, that he was the Republican nominee for president. He met a Democrat from southern Illinois who said, quote, "So, you're Abe Lincoln." Lincoln said, "Yes, that is my name." And this guy said, "They say you're a self-made man." And Lincoln said, well, yes, what there is of me is self-made. And then this guy said, "Well, all I've got to say is that it was a damn bad job." So Lincoln liked telling these stories that were really his self-deprecating humor. Well, that concludes today's presentation. Next time we'll continue with part 9 of Abraham Lincoln, which was really the beginning of the Civil War. Hope you find a good history book to read. There's so many wonderful history books to read. You might consider checking out our website, Adventures in History with Peter J. Ray at peterjray.com. So far, we've made 722 history videos in 7 areas: world history, American history, book reviews, poetic tours, Cleveland baseball, family history, and autobiography. There's a donate feature. You might consider making a donation so we can continue making these videos. If you live in Metro Manila, Philippines, and are looking for a high school, you might consider Restless Educational Center. Restless is located on Allenby Street in San Juan, Metro Manila, Philippines, not far from the corner of P. Guevara and Wilson Street. At Restless, we specialize in helping young people who have had difficulty in the larger traditional high schools. We strive to make the school day interesting so the students enjoy going to school and enjoy learning. And Restless is more than a school. It's a warm, supportive community. And the website is restless.education, RESALEST. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care. And I'll see you next time.